Foley, at page 19 of your statement, you refer to the registration of medical practitioners, and in particular, you state that there's a capacity to monitor the compliance of medical practitioners with conditions that are placed upon their registration. Can you explain how that is actually done?
Yes, I can. Under the national law, registered health professions are maintained on a national register by a process which has been brought about by all the states and territories agreeing on common legislation that sets up the national structures. And then we in New South Wales have also the role of the Healthcare Complaints Commission and the Health Professional Councils. And with that national registration process, then and the benefit of digitisation, the conditions can be placed on a health practitioner's practice, as has been extensively talked about in this case study, and that is noted on the public record of the registration and is accessible by any citizen by simply going to the website of the national body for any of the registered health professions. So it is very, very transparent when conditions are on a licence. In addition, here in New South Wales, the Health Professional Councils send weekly to all our health services relevant notifications of relevant health practitioners who have conditions placed upon them, and each of the health districts and specialty health networks then have their internal processes to receive those and to act on those. In addition, we also have, as I've said in my statement, a requirement that districts annually actively review all the medical appointments against the National Register and conditions. And we're also considering whether we should extend that to all the other professions, although now that the process of national registration is fully developed, the fact that they're getting those weekly notifications, we haven't devised what's the most efficient and effective way to actually do that, and whether we need that further step or not.
Right. And that notification is not just for medical practitioners but also psychologists?
It's all registered health professions.
At page 30 of your statement, Dr. Foley, you refer to the information sharing capacity of the New South Wales Health in relation to various government agencies and non-government agencies. How does that information sharing procedure work?
Look, this is a very important part of particularly of the preventative and early intervention aspects of the keeping them safe approach here in New South Wales to child protection. So the way it works is that we've talked about the mandatory reporting requirements where someone who works in healthcare determines that there is a risk or a potential risk to a child. If that child is found to be at risk of significant harm, then that gets mandatorily reported and appropriately notified, and if it's criminal action, it goes to the JERT team, which has already been discussed, and that process takes over. However, if it's judged that the child is below that threshold, but there is still concern, the reporting process allows that to be noted. We encourage our health workers to contact our child wellbeing units, who are there to give them advice and guidance, And a very important part of the role of the units is not just to make sure that mandatory reporting happens and happens effectively and people are guided in that. It also is very important as encouraging this early intervention and support of the child and the family, and to facilitate the information sharing. And so if a health worker has a concern but it doesn't reach the threshold for mandatory reporting, that is still noted in the WellNet system that operates between agencies and is maintained by the wellness units. And then health workers are encouraged by our units to then, if there is information, for instance, that a teacher or a school has a concern about the same child, or the families come to attention through fax, for example, or even that there's some police information there. But particularly education is the one where health has a very strong relationship in terms of this early intervention. Then the worker is encouraged and facilitated to get in touch with the school, with the teacher, and it starts to develop some casework. And the important thing about Section 16A of the Child Protection legislation is that that provides the legislative umbrella under which this can be done, such that it can be done without consent, although health workers are encouraged to let children and families know that this might be done. And it also, if it's done in good faith, takes away any risk for those people in health and education having any risk of defamation or other action from taking this. Now, what this enables is that something that is something of a concern or a flag that's noticed in one place, by this sharing can actually give a bigger picture, so that might change the assessment of risk to being at risk of significant harm. But even more importantly, it also allows for that early intervention to find out, is there more going on, or can we refer the child or the family to a family referral service or some other set of services which might help to ameliorate, avoid or prevent the harm. So the information sharing is a critical piece of the prevention as well as the detection and the sort of identifying and then dealing with abuse if it happens.
And is there any guidance within that system as to who does the information sharing, whether it's the person who is the coalface who has the concern? Is there any guidance within the organisation as to whether they should check with somebody internally first before they go outside of the local health district?
Yes, this is very much the role of the child wellbeing units. They receive 300, the health ones receive 300 calls a week. So that's about 15,000 a year. Of that, about somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 turn into registered information, either that meets the threshold or is there for information as to a concern. And about, I think it's about a bit over 3,500 result in information sharing happening of the nature I described, and that's guided and facilitated by the child wellbeing units. So as you know, the identity of mandatory reporters is protected, but the child wellbeing units know how to navigate, so that's respected, and yet the right conversations can be had and people put in touch with each other in a way that's going to work. That's different from the other level of information sharing, which of course can be about facilitating a prosecution or some other action which needs to be taken of a regulatory and intervention nature for children that are very much at risk of harm.
I don't have any further questions, Your Honour.
Yes. I have a few questions, Your Honour. Dr Foley, as the head of New South Wales... I apologise. Dr Foley, my name is Kumar and I am counsel for AWC. Dr Foley, as the head of New South Wales Health, have you looked at the documentation in respect of the allegations of sexual abuse by Dr Rolleston?
Yes, I have.
And when did New South Wales Health first become aware of the allegations of child sexual abuse by Dr. Rolleston?
Well, I need to be precise here because you use the term New South Wales Health, which is a collective word for a range of entities and individuals within those entities. So as far as I'm aware, in terms of the ministry being aware, it wasn't until we were canvassing for any instances of child sexual abuse in response to the Commission's request for any information that we might have in our files about, going back for some time, about instances of abuse. So that was certainly around that time that it came to my attention, and I think within the ministry. Clearly there's other instances from the evidence from survivors about where they were revealing this in clinical settings as adults seeking adult clinical services and revealing it. So those individuals within New South Wales Health heard different things about that, so some revelation there. And of course we've got from the survivors' stories where even earlier in the piece it's parents endeavoured or others endeavoured to get in touch with health services. I think Mr Kirkpatrick particularly with New South Wales Health Services. And it's not clear what happened to that information.
So are you saying that New South Wales Health first became aware of Dr Rolleston's conduct as a result of this commission or at another time?
He'd already been identified as back in is it 8 and then 10 in terms of restrictions on practice and the allegations being drawn together and so on, and action to prosecute under criminal law was afoot, and so I think as documents were requested from New South Wales Health entities and further inquiries made, then I presume, and I'm presuming because it goes back before my time in this role, it was starting to come apparent then. Then there were the criminal convictions, and then those same instances, or most of those same instances, were taken forward for the medical tribunal. But my understanding is that we at the ministry did not have the full story on Rolleston until we had the tribunal outcomes and also then around that time the Royal Commission request for information.
Now, the medical tribunal outcome was in 2013. That is the date that Dr Rolleston was deregistered.
Yes.
Were you aware that Dr Rolleston's conditions for registration were amended in 2009?
In 2009. I'd have to check that, but my understanding is that the processes back then, there was a process that would predate the national arrangements. So I understand there was arrangements that the New South Wales Medical Board would advise the system of conditions on medical practitioners, but I'd have to absolutely check how that worked. Now, of course, it works by means of the health professional councils send those to all our health services.
Does Broken Hill Hospital come under the responsibility of New South Wales Health?
Yes, it does.
What steps did New South Wales Health take to assess the risk of Dr Rolleston harming children who came into his care while he was at Broken Hill Hospital from the time that New South Wales Health became aware of the allegations of child sexual abuse by Dr. Rolleston?
I'm not familiar with, well, let me go back a step. I have had extensive conversations with the local health district to ask about to the extent people were involved or could recall, about how the issues around Rolleston being engaged at Broken Hill. I was interested on, particularly from the point of view of, well, as I understand from the timing, that when he went there, he had convictions for medifraud that were substantial and significant, that had led to restraints on or conditions on his practice. At that stage, his history of sexual abuse of children was not known, and how he came to be appointed, and then what was the basis of continuing appointment. As I understand it from talking to people that could recall that time, and I think it's also there's corroboration of that in some of the papers tendered from the Medical Council, that they were aware there were restrictions on his practice, but which was that he could work at that time a public hospital, but no detail of the conviction for medifraud. My understanding is he then worked at Broken Hill Hospital as the medical director for about 3 years, and then resigned after misconduct issues were raised, I gather, relating to financial claims and that kind of thing at the hospital. And then he set up in private practice as a GP, but did still do weekend work or sort of casual work in the emergency department at the hospital from time to time. From what I understand, we don't have clear records as to exactly at what point his continuing engagement at all in Broken Hill Hospital ceased, and I'd have to take advice as to whether there was whether he was actually practising at the time that he was first had conditions placed on him for chaperoning, and then, of course, his suspension, which was then maintained at 8-week intervals until such time as he was prosecuted. So I would need to take further advice to just understand exactly how the notifications worked and what was known at Broken Hill at that time.
So to answer the question as to what steps that New South Wales Health took, are you not able to say what precise steps New South Wales Health took after it became aware of the allegations of sexual abuse by Dr. Rolleston?
I'm not aware of what steps were taken when there was that, when those initial conditions were placed, which was before my time, so I'd have to go and ask about that. And then that converted, as I say, to full suspension, which meant that, I presume, to the extent that he was practising at Broken Hill at all, that ceased. And in speaking with the chief executive of Far West, he advised that when he took up his appointment, which I think was in late 2010 or early 2011, Dr. Rolleston wasn't practising in the hospital. So I haven't been able to ascertain precisely what happened before then.
Are you able to say what systems Broken Hill Hospital had in place to protect children who were under Dr. Rolleston's care from the date that his practicing certificate was or had conditions imposed on it. So that is 2009.
Yes. Broken Hill Hospital and the area health service that would have been part of at that time would have had the systems and procedures required by the policy documents at that time, which have requirements about child protection and mandatory reporting in the form it was then. I'm not familiar enough with the policies that were in place before my time as Secretary. I haven't studied them to know exactly what ones would have been in place then.
Was Dr.
But again, I'm happy to find that out if the Commission wishes.
Was Dr. Rolleston placed on the New South Wales Health Service Check Register for public hospitals?
I'm not sure of the answer to that question. The Service Check Register is a relatively recent development which was put in place, I understand, after the Dr. Graham Reeves case in Bega, and where in that case the not being able to have good information to be shared across the system about any constraints or restraints on a doctor's conduct or reports of their poor conduct and any restraints on their practice was not readily able to be detected across the health service. And so the Service Check Register, following an independent review, was recommended and put in place. That's the advice I have. And I think, if I may just check, I think yes, so the Service Check Register came into being in 2009, I understand, and so I'd have to confirm as to whether if Dr. Rolleston was engaged, even as a sort of occasional visiting practitioner at Broken Hill at that time. He would have gone, if he had been found guilty of, not found guilty, but if misconduct issues had arisen of any kind, then that would needed to be noted on that register. I don't know whether that was the case. Also, if there were conditions on his licence, that would have been advised to the area health service and the hospital. That doesn't necessarily go on the Service Check Register, which is to capture misconduct of employees and visiting practitioners in the health system. So there's two different routes of advice and check. So I'd have to see whether Rolleston's name had appeared on the Service Check Register.
So you're not able to say whether it was placed on the register or not?
No, but we can check. But I'm saying he having a condition placed on practice wouldn't necessarily be recorded in the Service Check Register unless it was directly associated with a misconduct matter as an employee or contractor of the service. That's what the Service Check Register is for. And then the process of conditions on registration is found by accessing the registration information, which at that stage would have been state-based, and also there was a process, as I understand it, of that advice being provided from the medical board to the health services. So that's how that information would have flowed.
Just to be clear, did New South Wales Health become aware of the sexual abuse allegations from the medical board or from the Healthcare Complaints Commission or from New South Wales Police? Can you, or from some other entity? Are you in a position to say who provided New South Wales Health with the information that there were allegations of sexual abuse by Dr Ralston on children?
I'd have to go back and ask those questions, because the time we're talking about is in a year or two before I commenced in this position, so I'm not sure how that came to attention.
I'll withdraw that. To your knowledge, were there any complaints to New South Wales Health of Dr Ralston's conduct in respect of child sexual abuse that were received prior to 1979?
Sorry, the first part of that question again?
Are you aware of any complaints of child sexual abuse by Dr Ralston that were provided to New South Wales Health prior to 1979?
From sitting here and hearing the evidence from the survivors, there were some instances where very early in the piece, family or others raised it. So I'm just trying to recall the dates, but in the case of one of the survivors, it was the issues were raised with general practice and private practitioners. Mr. Kirkpatrick, whose father raised it, was not Dr Rolleston. So I'm just trying to reflect from the evidence given as to whether there's evidence that attempts were made to make it known to New South Wales Health.
If Dr Rolleston was to obtain his medical certificate, would there be a record on some register which would disclose these child sexual abuse allegations?
Are we talking about now or then?
Yes.
Sorry?
Now, Dr. Foley, now.
So, okay. So if Dr Rolleston was currently practising within a New South Wales Health facility and these issues were starting to be raised now, the ways they would come to attention, it wouldn't yet be through conditions on registration unless the... I'm just trying to think. It's hard. We're being hypothetical now. So I think once the abuses are being raised and starting to be dealt with by the regulatory authorities, it would come to then, that would bring it to the attention of the medical council, whose job it is to look urgently at matters like this and to look at whether conditions or suspensions, conditions or suspensions need to be applied. And that did eventually happen, but if we're talking about if these things would be happening now, rather than trying to go back to events in the past, and then those conditions would be advised to health services, and the conditions would appear on the registration.
Is that on the doctor's own registration to practice?
That's certainly to be on the national database, but I also understand it would be on any documentation that the doctor has.
If I could show you a document which is Exhibit 2721. Dr. Foley, the first page of this document has a heading, Managing Potential Misconduct, Guideline 6, and then it's a notification requirements checklist. Would you like to have a look at the rest of that document? If I'll take you to it, page 2, you just scroll down, is a summary of notification requirements. And in particular, Tick 3 provides staff to notify New South Wales Police immediately if there is alleged criminal conduct which may not be notifiable to the helpline, brackets, for example, child pornography, comma, historical child sexual assault, close brackets.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this document?
Yes.
Can you describe to the Commission what it is?
It's a checklist attachment to the policy directive about handling misconduct of employees or visiting practitioners engaged in New South Wales health services, in other words, public healthcare services.
Is that a policy called Managing Misconduct, and it appears at tab 400 of the tender bundles. I'll just show you a document, Dr. Foley, which is tab 400. And this is a policy directive managing misconduct.
Yes, that's the one.
So this document, that is the checklist, goes together with this policy directive. Is that the situation?
That's correct. I think the one you've shown me is referred to as sheet 6 in the body of the document.
Thank you. And can you tell the Commission when this guideline commenced?
Well, as the date says there on the front of the policy directive, its publication date was the 21st of November 2014. That would have replaced, if you scroll down.
If you could scroll down. Thank you.
It should summarise what documents it replaces. Yes, there they are. So again, it's seeking to bring together a number of policy directives and to update them. So I'm not sure what preceded it, but that's the policy directive in place from 21st of November 2014.
The third tick that I took you to earlier, Doctor, refers to staff notifying New South Wales Police immediately. Can you explain to the Commission what that requirement involves?
Yes, it goes to, if I take you to the very comprehensive policy directive on child protection, it goes to it goes to, sorry, let me just get this right. It goes to the provisions around if the perpetrator is a New South Wales health employee or a visiting practitioner, and the requirements as a reportable incident that it needs to be advised to the Ombudsman and other sets of reporting, including to the police, put in place, because this is an attachment to a directive that is about handling misconduct of employees and visiting practitioners within our service. So it's not relating to any disclosure of any childhood sexual abuse, which a patient might do as an adult when they're accessing health services, public or private. It's going to, the situation here is where it's about misconduct of an employee or visiting practitioner that's in New South Wales Health.
Can you say, Dr. Foley, what New South Wales Health does to enforce and review and promote that policy? That is the requirement that staff are to notify New South Wales Police immediately if there is an allegation of historical child sexual assault by a doctor?
Yeah. The policy, and recognising that this policy, which is about how to deal with misconduct more broadly in all types of misconduct, including, as the heading here said, child-related allegations, charges and convictions. The document is seeking to draw together in one document how to deal with misconduct issues, which is one dimension of, for instance, if a medical practitioner was employed within New South Wales Health was found to be sexually abusing children. And so it's cross-referencing and drawing together a whole series of considerations. So, and that's the objective here, and the recent date is what we're trying to do generally, so people don't have to go, if they read one document because they're coming at it from a misconduct way, they're going to be guided to the full range of issues and where to cross-reference to. So, so in terms of your question about how we supporting the awareness and compliance with these requirements, it is principally through the child protection guidelines and education that we have in the system quite intensively, which focused around the release of that updated and very comprehensive policy in 2013, and the mandatory training and other training which we offer in and around what to do with dealing with and preventing and reporting child sexual abuse.
Doctor, a concerning matter in the Dr. Rolleston case study is that a number of doctors were notified of the child sexual abuse allegations,
yes,
and there wasn't a report to police or to the Healthcare Complaints Commission. Would you say that steps have now been put into place to address that deficiency?
Well, certainly legislatively, there is now several different pieces of legislation in place that place requirements on medical practitioners in private practice. Their mandatory reporting under child protection law applies to them as much as to any other health service provider. And also they have the additional requirements of the national law, which requires health practitioners to advise the appropriate authorities in relation to registration of health professionals if they are aware of serious misconduct, which could include sexual abuse or other abuse of children. So there's a number of ways in which there is an onus on the general practitioner or the medical specialist if they detect something. I think we have in New South Wales Health, while we're not directly responsible for the delivery of general practitioner services or private medical specialist services in the community, we certainly look at how we can work with doctors in private practice, and we have in 2013 conducted a trial with a special regulation put in place so that general practitioners could use our child wellbeing units and use that to fulfil their mandatory reporting as well as and be provided extra support so they'd have somewhere to go. And on the basis of that trial, we're now expecting that government will take amendments to the legislation forward in this coming session of Parliament with a view to extending that access to all general practitioners and medical specialists in private practice, both for the support on mandatory reporting, but also importantly so they can come under the umbrella of 16A and the sharing of information as well. So I think that will provide, will strengthen and provide extra support to medical practitioners in individual or small group practice to be better supported, to be able to understand their obligations and to fulfil them.
Thank you, Dr Foley. I have no further questions, Your Honour and Commissioner.
Briefly, thank you very much. Dr Foley, my name is Windsor. I appear on behalf of the State of New South Wales. Could we have on the screen, please, the document at tab 396? Dr Foley, whilst that's coming up on the screen, you made reference on 2, possibly 3 occasions during the course of your evidence about a very comprehensive policy. And you made reference to that very comprehensive policy on the occasions that Ms Kumar was asking you questions about a notification form. Do you recall those series of questions?
Yes, I do.
Is the very comprehensive policy the one that you now see, or at least part of which you now see on the screen in front of you?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. We won't need that any further. The second issue is that you've just given evidence to this Royal Commission regarding the exchanges that have taken place between New South Wales Health, and I'll use that as a generic term just for the moment, and trials or case studies that you've undertaken with general practitioners. Is it more than one trial or only one trial that's been undertaken?
It was one trial in 2 geographic locations.
Right. Both of which were in, well, were they in the metropolitan area, or one in the metropolitan area, one elsewhere?
One was rural and one was metropolitan. And
what, if any, feedback or results or conclusions can be reached from those case studies, Dr. Foley?
The result was that the child wellbeing units found they could manage having that additional access from people that were not from within New South Wales Health, so that practical side of it worked. The GPs who accessed the service found it beneficial, and on that basis policy advice went forward that we could extend that process.
All right. And as you understand it, the legislation is to be placed before the Parliament in the forthcoming sitting of the State Parliament in New South Wales.
That's what I'm advised.
Do you know anything about the operation of such a scheme in other states?
No, I'm not familiar with whether something similar operates in other states.
Thank you. And one final area. You've sat and listened to all the evidence from all the victims, and indeed you've listened to evidence from others as well during the course of this particular case study. How have you reflected on what you've heard in the course of the last 4 days?
Firstly, a practical observation, and that is in terms of where can we improve. I think looking at the stories from each of the survivors and their attempts to bring Dr. Rolleston to account to protect other children, and then responses as these adults were coming into services in our system, and then where did that lead? I think that there's room for us to look at how we look specifically at the adult who has child sexual abuse has happened to them, and then and now it's only coming out, some decades later. I think we need very specific advice and some education around that, because the policies, as you can see, and that the core policy document that I highlighted from 2013 is very much organised about policies for services that are dealing with children, aimed at staff who are dealing with children. And the issue, of course, is in these instances, from this terrible case study, is that we have adults accessing adult services. And so I think we need, while we can go through the documents and point out the different relevant components, my own view, having reviewed this and in conversation with others about, I think there's probably more work we can do to have enhanced guidelines and support to staff in that circumstance. The other thing I'd like to say, if I may, Your Honour, is to acknowledge the terrible things that happened to the survivors who've testified in this case study, for Dr. Rolleston and also Mr. Kirkpatrick's experience with the psychologist. It's a terrible thing. It shouldn't have happened. Something like this should never happen. And I'm very sorry that it has happened. As Secretary of New South Wales Health, I can assure the Commission that my focus and our focus is on what are all the things we can do and implement effectively that can stop this happening again. And we're very open to suggestions and recommendations about how we can improve that, both from the testimony of the survivors, who had many practical and positive suggestions, and of course from the findings of the Commission.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Bennett, any questions?
No further.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. Thank you for coming and speaking with us. You're now excused.
Thank you.
Yes.
Your Honour, I have no further witnesses for this afternoon.
Does that bring, with the exception of the two who are coming on Friday,
Indeed.
does that bring the evidence to a close? And
That's right, on Friday morning.
Right.
And tomorrow morning we'll be commencing with the witnesses in relation to part 3 of the study from Victoria.
Very well. We'll adjourn until 10 o'clock in the morning.